So our speaker this evening is an alumni of Selwyn College, Cambridge. He's done a lot of research through his career in the RAF, but is intending to apply for a PhD through publication, which is a route that I wasn't particularly familiar with. It's on offer to alumni of Selwyn College, obviously. Our speaker is an expert on the air-land battle, having served in a number of appointments during his time in the RAF, was a member of the RAF regiment, and now is going to give us a talk this evening on something that I find fascinating, which is the early years of the RAF, but not on the Western Front, not in the First World War, but in those years between the wars when we were still doing campaigning, if you like, on the Northwest frontier. So, John Alexander, welcome this evening. We're looking forward to your talk. I'm going to leave the stage and allow you to put up your slides, and I'll come back for the moderated session.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Dudley, for that introduction, and thanks to the Society and to Andrew Bamford in particular for inviting me to speak. And thanks again to Dudley for all of the briefs on the IT. So hopefully I won't need to use my IA drills. So I intend to speak for about 45 minutes, and then I'm very happy to answer questions or engage in discussion. One of my reasons for joining the Society is to meet like-minded people with similar research interests. So very interested to hear your views or take your questions. So this is Miranshah Fort in Waziristan. It's home of a Royal Air Force detachment, and it's the headquarters of the Tochi Scouts, the resident of Waziristan, and a political agent for North Waziristan. As you can see, in the front there are some aircraft on a landing strip. Behind the aircraft, you can see gates in the wall of the fort leading to hangars and accommodation in what is the RAF compound of the fort at this end. At the far side, you can see some trees, gardens. So that's the residence of the resident of Waziristan, the British political officer who has political control. It's also where the officers' mess of the Tochi Scouts is. And the remainder of the fort is a barracks. So it's the barracks for the headquarters, and it's the barracks for one of the wings of the Scouts. I'll go into more detail later. So there's about 700 men there, of whom only about 25 or 30 are RAF, and the remainder are Tochi Scouts or civilians. To the right, top right, you can see a civilian settlement. I mean, that's now grown. It's now Miranshah, which completely surrounds where the fort was. In the distance, you can see the remains of a camp, if you have really good eyesight, which is Dardoni. That in the early 20s was a camp, a cantonment for a British brigade. There's also a landing strip there, where there was, and 5 Squadron RAF were based there. But that camp was abandoned in 1924, as I'll explain. And then beyond that, you can see the foothills of the Suleiman Mountains. At the top of those mountains is a Durand line separating spheres of influence between British India and Afghanistan. And so where is this? So this is a map showing Waziristan. So the shaded area is Waziristan. To the northwest is Afghanistan. So that dashed line is the Durand line. To the northwest, to the southeast There's another shaded line. That's the border between the tribal areas, the tribal agencies, and administered India. So that's known as the administered line. And then hopefully you can make out my map symbols I've drawn on this map. So top center, there's a propeller. So that's showing where Miranshah is. There should also be an infantry symbol there because the Tochi Scouts headquarters is there. You can see 3 brigade symbols. Bottom left is at Manzai. It's a cantonment to the south of the Mahsud area. Right of that is a battalion symbol. That's Jendola. That's the headquarters of the South Waziristan Scouts. And just below that is another brigade symbol, Tonk. Above that, towards Miranshah, another brigade symbol, that's the cantonment of Razmak. To the east of Miranshah is another brigade at Bannu, just over the administrative line, a railhead and cantonment. And then to the north of that is another scout headquarters at Tal. So a mixture of regular brigades, Army of India brigades in cantonments and scout formations. And I'll explain how all this fits together. So my aim really is to show how this works and how it came about. And my research started because I'm interested in T. Lawrence. And T. Lawrence served at Miranshah in 1928 as T.E. Shaw, as an aircraftman in the RAF detachment. And when you work out from that, you know, why the RAF? Why is there this RAF detachment co-located with the Tochi Scouts? Why are they in the centre of Waziristan? What are they doing? And how do they work with the scout formations that are there? And less so with the army formations, because I think that's better known. But the gap seems to be how do they work with the scouts? And there's a gap in the literature, I think, and one of the reasons is this is a relatively quiet period on the frontier. The conventional wisdom, you know, we've all seen the films, we've read the books. We think there's a continual conflict on the northwest frontier involving the army in India fighting the Pashtun tribes, whereas the reality is the 20s are a period of relative peace between the spike on the left there, which is the Third Anglo-Afghan War, and the Waziristan campaign that follows it, and the spike on the right, which is the 36-38 Waziristan campaign, which runs into the Second World War. So that's the British campaign against the supporters of the Fakir of Ipi, as the British knew him. And as I said, there is a gap in the literature, and even in the literature of the time. So left there is Passing It On by Skeen. It's like the handbook for the army on the frontier. This is a second edition dated 1932. And oddly, it seems to me, it mentions the Air Force. It mentions using the Air Force for reconnaissance. It mentions using the Air Force in attack. It doesn't mention the Frontier Scouts, which I was fascinated by. But you don't have to look very far to find the Scouts and find the Air Force, but they're very rarely mentioned together. So on the right, the General Wondered Why, an anthology by Robert Lineman of the future Field Marshal William Slim's short stories that he published under pseudonyms between the wars in various magazines and newspapers. There's one in there, it's called The Northwest Frontier Explained. And in it, Slim writes, to carry out the day-to-day duties of watch and ward, the political officer has his own armed forces. The Khasadars, a rough form of tribal police, who provide their own arms, and the Frontier Scouts, picked men, well-equipped and disciplined, probably the finest light infantry in the world. Well, I think it's probably quite significant, isn't it? If Slim describes you, Slim, a Gurkha officer, plenty of time on the frontier himself, if he's describing the Scouts as the finest infantry in the world, then that's quite significant, no mean praise. In another Slim short story called The Bombing Circle, he describes a punitive bombing raid, which we'll come on to, not the same raid, but we'll come on to an example punitive bombing raid towards the end of my talk. But he mentions both, but not together. And in another classic of the frontier, John Masters' Bugles and the Tiger, he has several passages on air support. It's conventional. It's what you would have expected to see in the First World War. It's similar to what's seen perhaps in the Second World War, a combination of reconnaissance and close air support. And also he has a long passage on the Scouts because his Gurkha battalion does an assault with a company of Scouts. So again, he's quite complimentary. There are relatively few sources on the Scouts themselves. Probably the best one, the most comprehensive is the one on the right by Trench. It's a ripping yarn, really. It's a series of anecdotes, some of which are difficult to believe. But there are relatively few other sources. And it's interesting, I found that the Pakistan sources for this period draw on Trench. They basically repeat what Trench has said. Obviously, they're much better and much more accurate, perhaps, in the post-partition period. But Trench has been my go-to source for the Scouts. But other than that, the Indian Army, British Indian Army historiography is about the army. It's not about the Scouts. More of the recent historiography is about the martial races, what's going on in India. So the Scouts are peripheral to that because they're not part of the army. They are civilian armed forces. They are employed by the political agent. Their officers, what would be Viceroy commissioned officers in the Indian Army, their officers are what would now be junior commissioned officers, are commissioned by the Chief Commissioner of Northwest Frontier Province. And then the Air Force historiography, what there is, a lot of it is focused on the relationship between the Indian Army and the Air Force and the place of the Air Force in India, where it's financed by the Army, where it's often underfunded, and where it wants to have control through air control, through punitive bombing, and where the Indian Army doesn't want that. It wants the Air Force to support it through air-land integration that we'd be familiar with now. And a lot of the historiography focuses on the big action. So it focuses on the Third Anglo-Afghan War, it focuses on the Waziristan campaign after that, or it focuses on 36 onwards and the Fakir of Ipi. So as I said, one of the ways I came to this was through Lawrence. So as a source, in this case, because he gives us a different perspective, and his letters survive, and other people write about him. So he is a source for what the Air Force are doing at Waziristan. A lot of what's written about him is rubbish. This is the Imperial War Museum, a picture from the Imperial War Museum collection. I think it's probably quite typical. It's describing him as a clerk in a wireless station, in the wireless station at Miranshah. Well, it's not a wireless station, it's an airfield, and it's co-located with the Scouts. And they seem more interested in his wrist than what he was actually doing there. So I think one has to be careful with using Lawrence as a source but it's better than nothing. And I'm fortunate enough to have been there when embedded with the Pakistan military. So this is 2014 when the Pakistan military went back into Waziristan. So this is from the fort, looking in the direction pretty much of that first picture that I showed you, and the guy, the soldier there with the helmet and the AK is a Tochi Scout, a latter day Tochi Scout. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the situation on the frontier at that time. The rhythm of the frontier is a quote from Churchill, from Malaccan Field Force, obviously friend of Lawrence. And the Indian Army general and scholar Sir George McMahon characterized the frontier as a greater and lesser problem. The greater problem was the defense of everyday peaceful citizens within the administrative border from their fellow British subjects, the Pathans or the Pashtun, within our political border, but outside that administrative border. The other problem was defending India against invasion. So another map of Waziristan, bottom left, shows you it in perspective to modern day Pakistan and India. It's a big place. The tribal areas in total are 27,000 square miles, 3 times the size of Wales. Then they had a population of 1 million or so, probably. It's 7 million now. An area which had been fought over throughout history. So the Mughals tried to defend India by a forward policy, defending the Hindu Kush, so a line from Kabul through to Kabul. Then you have the Duranis going the other way, and then you have the Sikhs. The Sikhs pretty much went up to the same administrative line that the British did. So they had what the British called a close border policy of protecting the administrative line and then just responding to raids across the border. And the Durand line was an attempt to demarcate Afghan and British spheres of influence, although the downside was that it crossed tribal areas and split villages from their agricultural areas and split tribes. So the British, as I said, tended to follow what was called a close border policy. So they protected, controlled the administrative line, and then responded to raids in so-called butcher and bolt expeditions in the 19th century. There are increasing numbers of these. There were 11 from 1857 to 1877, and there were 12 from 1877 to 1881. And that was followed by a forward policy. So you have the Second Anglo-Afghan War, you have the Malaccan Field Force, the north of here, you have Tirah to the north of here. It's all very expensive. And so when Lord Curzon became Viceroy, he adopted a close border policy. And he recruited militia, so the forerunners of the Frontier Scouts, to patrol the tribal areas. And the army was based on the Indian side of the administrative line. In the First War, things are fairly peaceful. But in May 1919, Amanullah Khan, the Emir of Afghanistan, invaded British India. The army, demobilizing at the time, was slow to support the Scouts, and the Scouts basically collapsed. There were several thousand desertions, several thousand modern rifles lost. The South Waziristan militia alone lost 1,200 Lee-Enfield rifles and 700,000 rounds of ammunition. And given that each rifles were like gold dust, service rifles like gold dust on the frontier, they're worth about 500 or 600 rupees, which, given that a scout was paid 15 rupees a month, you can work out the value of a rifle. So the Khyber rifles were disbanded because they not only deserted but mutinied and killed some of their officers. The fighting, as I'm sure you know, continued for some time in Waziristan. In late 23, there were still 5 armoured brigades in Waziristan. In 1921, there were 600 tribal raids into the settled area, and there were 100 murdered in Dera Ismail Khan, there on the bottom right of the map. There were 100 murdered in 1 year by raids by Mahsuds alone. But the level of violence soon decreased. One reason was Amanullah Khan had other threats and stopped interfering quite so much in the tribal areas in Waziristan. The other was that the British realized that the way they were garrisoning Waziristan was incredibly expensive in blood and treasure. And one reason for that was just the way that they did it. So you had brigade columns trying to engage the tribesmen. Each brigade was massive. The supply line of brigade was massive. This is Razmak column a little bit later, but you can see that column of camels. Each of them have drivers, so there are lots of civilians there as well. And to protect those columns, the British developed a very sophisticated, laborious way of protecting them by putting pickets up onto the top of the hills, which was extremely challenging, especially when the pickets withdrew. So the columns were easy to attack. The columns were provocative. The Indian government argued that the columns provoked the tribesmen. The Indian government was trying to save money. The Indian government was trying to reduce the size of the army, and this really wasn't helping. And the Indian government wanted to revert to a close border policy. General Rawlinson was in command of the Indian army. He played a bit of a double hand with London because he wanted to keep the army in Waziristan. And the compromise was called the Razmak policy. So cantonments were built in the tribal areas, but the idea was these brigade cantonments. The idea was that the brigades stayed in the cantonments basically, and only very occasionally came out on columns. So the idea was that it would be less provocative than they would otherwise be. So the Razmak cantonment, for example, a Razmak brigade was a massive brigade. It's six battalions. So 4 battalions can go out in a column, and there's still 2 battalions left to protect the camp. So mainly Indian. One of those, just one of those battalions was British. But as part of this, in mid-24, the military control of Waziristan ended, and control was handed back to the political officers, the political agents. So the political agents were really entirely responsible for what was going on in their agency. But they weren't governing the agency, they were just controlling it. They were just trying to stop those raids over the administrative line. So they're responsible for policing, they're responsible for executive and judicial functions, and they're answerable by the Chief Commissioner for Northwest Frontier Province in Peshawar. They're answerable through him to the government of India. And the primary method of control was bribery. So they paid the tribesmen, the tribes, not to raid India. So, for example, the viziers with 30,000 armed men, 15,000 of whom had modern rifles, they were paid 72,000 rupees a year, which is worth about $250,000 now. I'm never quite sure that these calculations seem to work because it doesn't sound very much. The more difficult Mahsuds with 18,000 armed men were paid 108,000 rupees. But a second form of bribery was paying the Khasadars, paying them maliks to employ Khasadars. So here we see, this is the method of government. So this is the jirga. At the table in the center is the political agent. Next to him is a British Scout officer. In the background, you can see scouts protecting the agent. And then you can see here a keel, a sect over the men. It's Pashtunwala, everyone has a voice. There are maliks that are representative, but basically everyone has a say. It's not a court of law. There's no legal representation. It's just a meeting to resolve disputes. And the agent's word, it's not final because it won't be, might not be obeyed, but he's the one that makes the decision. As I said, part of the bribery is employing Khasadars. So this is new in 23, 24. So these are local men. The maliks are given money. In Waziristan, it totals 1.9 million rupees, which is several million now. And they're paid pretty much to watch and ward. They guard the roads. The roads are open 1 or 2 days a week for a couple of hours, using a mixture of Khasadars, scouts, and a column near the cantonment. They bring their own arms, so you can see all these have Martini Henrys, and there's a large number of them. And some British think they get paid too much. It sort of skews the economy, really, because you're paying people just to sit by the side of the road rather than do other things. They're reasonably reliable. They tend not to want to get into a blood feud, so they shoot high, but the guys firing at them from the same tribe do the same. There's a couple of cases where they kill the people they're meant to be protecting, the agent or whatever. There's a couple of occasions over this 15-year period. But those are the Khasadars. So that's sort of the solution is the political agent. He pays for the Khasadars. He pays for the scouts. I'll say more about the scouts in a moment. And if they can't control what's going on, then the next stage is to call in the army or call in the air force. So this a modern map showing the different tribes. I've got 2 points here. One is that some of the tribes are within India, so they're all this side of the Durand line. Other tribes are trans-frontier tribes found on both sides of the frontier. The scouts are recruited from these tribes, so the Khasadars are local men, definitely recruited from the tribes. The scouts are tribesmen, but because of the experience in the Third Anglo-Afghan War, the Tochi Scouts in North Waziristan, the South Wazir Scouts, do not recruit Mahsuds or Wazirs. They recruit some Wazirs, but not very many. So they recruit tribesmen from elsewhere. So quite a few come from Swat, from the Yusufzai tribe. Some are Momons, some are Afridis, some are Durs, some are Kataks. So they recruit a mix of tribes, and they organize them in tribal platoons, but mix the platoons up within companies. So the Air Force on the frontier. So the role of the Indian Army now is covering force, which is the frontier, a field force, which is to fight a peer-on-peer invader, or to deploy in support of the empire elsewhere, and then internal security. And the Air Force role follows that. So as you can see from the map on the left, the white aircraft are the main bases. They're all pretty much facing the northwest frontier because that's the expected route of invasion. But while they're there, they can also assist the covering force in preventing raids, the tribal raids. And two ways of doing that, and this is a cause of dispute between the Army and the Air Force. One role for the Air Force is to support the Army and doing that air-land integration, so reconnaissance and attack. The other role is where the military control, if you like, is given to the Air Force, and the Air Force actually conduct the punitive raids on the tribes. And I'll explain that in a bit more as we go through. So in India, the Air Force come under the Army. So it's worked pretty well. The Air Force first deploy, 31 Squadron first deploys in 1915. It's involved in trouble, supports the Army in trouble against the Mohmans during the First World War. The Air Force does very well in the Third Anglo-Afghan War. General Monroe, the Commander-in-Chief, is very complimentary. Again, it's mainly air-land integration. There's one raid on Kabul, but it's mainly in support of the Army, and it's the same in the Waziristan campaign. So if you like, at a tactical level, at a working level, the relations are really good, but it's seriously underfunded. And the Committee for Imperial Defence get to hear about this. They set up a committee and a subcommittee, as they always do. They send out John Salmond, who's like the number 2 at the Royal Air Force. He eventually takes over from Trenchard as Chief of the Air Staff. He writes a report. He finds of the 72 aircraft in India, only 7 are serviceable. The rest have been broken up for spares. So there's a bit of a fuss about that. And from then on, serviceability appears not to be an issue. But he also gets with the political officers and with the Chief Commissioner at the time, John Maffei, and he recommends that the RAF have a greater role on the frontier. He doesn't go as far as saying that the RAF should do everything. He suggests there might be times when they do that, but also they should support the Army. And so that ties in with the Razmak policy. It explains why Miranshah is there. So Pink's War, and there's an article by General Andrew in that reading list I gave you. But Pink's War against the Mahsuds in 1924 is held up normally to be the only time on the frontier where the Air Force were given a free hand to do their prescription bombing. And it works pretty well. It seems to work pretty well. So there's a dispute with some Mahsuds. The political agent asks for Air Force support. There's a relatively large force deployed to several airfields, including Miranshah, and they conduct a series of bombing raids over quite a long period of time, over several weeks. And the way this is done, they drop leaflets, white leaflets, which warn the tribes to leave their villages by a certain date. They drop red leaflets the day before. They bomb the villages, and then they bomb the villages. And the idea is an economic punitive raid. The tribesmen have left, taken cover in caves, or moves away. So it's their houses, it's their stores, their crops, their animals that are being hit. And Pink's War is held up to be a great success because it can be stopped and started, which it is. There are several periods when there's no bombing and when there's negotiation. Some of the Keel, some of the sects give up. Others continue, bombing starts again. But eventually it's resolved. As you can see there, there's 150 tons of bombs dropped, which is quite a lot for the time. But standard bomb is 112 pounds. Rounds fired. There's said to be 11 Pashtun killed. So it's thought to have been a lot less costly in blood and treasure on both sides than it would have been to send a brigade in, because once a brigade is there, it's there, and the tribesmen are going to attack it, and you're not going to get those periods of no action, those periods of negotiation. As we'll see, there are other examples of the political agents calling in air support. And the political agents are quite, I mean, it's they that have called in Pink's wing. The political agents like the aircraft. They use the aircraft for reconnaissance. There's a political agent called Butch Parsons. He's a major from the Indian Army. He actually gets a DSO flying on a reconnaissance sortie, getting injured in the arm, but directing the scouts, directing the ground forces successfully. And there are lots of other examples of where the political agents are complementary about being able to do reconnaissance, about the fact that aerial photography is being conducted, so suddenly they have maps, they know where places are. So lots of compliments from the political agents about the aircraft being there and the availability of the aircraft. So if we look again at the Tochi Scouts and the RAF at Miranshah, and again I'm looking for cooperation between the two of them. So this is another view of the fort from a slightly different angle. So there's cooperation because they're co-located. So the resident lives there. The political agent for North Waziristan lives there. The political agent for South Waziristan lives in Tonk, the other side of the administrative line, because he's got the Mahsud area and it's too dangerous for him to live in his agency. But political officers' gardens. This is the Air Force end of the camp. The scouts have ranged there, so the wings train their own recruits. There's actually an action on a recruit training range where a British officer is killed, so they're never that far away from danger. The scouts have machine guns, but they only use them in the fort, so the machine guns are in those towers. There's a mosque there for the scouts. They're all Sunnis here. In Kurum, they're Shia. Obviously one of the things it means is that the RAF compound, they're pretty much kept to themselves. In fact, the only airman that goes into the rest of the fort is Lawrence, because he's the clerk and he goes to the post office. But the others are confined to the RAF compound. So the Tochi Scouts guard the perimeter. The RAF guard their own compound. So the airmen, I think, do a 12-hour guard every 5 days. Again, Lawrence's letters explain that. Lawrence typically volunteers for Christmas Day, so he doesn't have to retreat with the others. So the Scouts officers' mess. So the RAF officers have their own officers' mess. The Scouts have their own have a mess where the single political agents mess as well. They do get together. There are examples in Trench of where they have functions together. But obviously the airmen, the Royal Air Force airmen, don't mix with the Scouts. They mess separately. The airmen have British food. Looks pretty good actually from this menu. It's Lawrence's job to drive to Bannu on the days the roads are open to get the mail, but also to get the fresh rations. So this is from later, but it's an example of what it would have looked like. They wouldn't have travelled in crossly armoured cars, so they've just gone on a Ford or a lorry or something. So visitors, the tall guy in the centre with the white hat is the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, who later became the Earl of Halifax and Foreign Secretary in the government. And the guy you can see a scout officer in the foreground, so presumably the Subadar major talking to a political officer in uniform. The white tabs are political officers. So they get on. They work together in the camp because they're living in the camp together. But what are they doing in the field together? So a bit more on the scouts. So as Slim said, the scouts are light infantry. They go on patrols called gashts. When they go on patrol, they carry a rifle, a bandolier of 140 rounds of ammunition, a water bottle, and some chapatis. And pretty much that's it. And typically they'll do 20 miles in a day on a gash. If they do more than 20 miles, the officers get an extra allowance, apparently. So it's quite popular to do more than 20 miles. And a patrol would be perhaps 4 platoons. So they're quite large, but they have no support weapons. They just have rifles. This guy's a signaller. So he's got 4 pigeons in his basket. He's carrying a signal message flag. They also had signalling lamps. So if he needs air support, he can send a message back to Miranshah. This guy's actually a South Waziristan scout, so to Jandola, or to a local scout fort, and they'll get a message back to the airfield. And according to Trench, there's always an aircraft on standby. Although I haven't seen that said in the Air Force records, but the Air Force records are not great. The squadron operation record books of the time aren't great, and this is a detached flight at Miranshah. So the operation record book would just say B flight detached to Miranshah and not more than that. But according to Trench, they can call in support using these methods. So this is the flight, or this is one of the flights. So they're detached from one of the main bases, a flight being either a half or a third of a squadron, so typically 4 aircraft. This is 27 Squadron, who are based normally at Kohat. There's a bomber squadron. They've got DH9s. Actually, the other type is an Army Cooperation Squadron that have Bristol fighters. On the frontier, they both carry out the same role. They can bomb if they have to, or they can do Army Cooperation if they have to. So this is it. This is the flight. It's normally about 25 men. So 4 or 5 pilots, including the flight commander. 27 Squadron is a bomber squadron, so it has sergeant pilots. About half of the junior pilots, as they might be called now, would be sergeants. So you can see the sergeants sat at the front, and then the airmen are a mix of trades. So there's 1 fitter and 1 rigger per aircraft, and then wireless mechanics, armourers, and a cook. So that's 27 Squadron. So that's the last flight that Lawrence serves with at Miranshah before he's repatriated. So Lawrence is one of the few permanent staff. This is 5 Squadron from Risalpur, just before Lawrence's time. So you can see they're dressed a bit more smartly. They've got a Bristol fighter. That's a Bristol fighter behind them. no sergeant pilots because there's an army cooperation squadron, and the army wouldn't accept artillery observation from other ranks. So army cooperation squadrons don't have sergeant pilots. Otherwise, there's not much difference. And that's the permanent staff, so including Lawrence as a wireless mechanic, a storeman, and an armourer, and a DH9 on a very wet airfield with a group of airmen trying to start the airfield. So other ways of communicating. So this is the Bristol fighter. You can see below the undercarriage a hook. So a line would be set between two poles, two trees, or if necessary, two bayonets from rifles, with a message tied to it. The aircraft would fly down. The hook would connect with the line, pick the message up. Quite difficult to do in the terrain, I would have thought, in Waziristan. And of course, it will give the position of the scouts away. But that's one method of communicating. The reverse is that the aircraft drops a message on the friendly troops. Another message is ground signalling. So the scouts had cotton strips, and they had they could form three messages. I'm okay, which was a cross. Enemy firing at me from this direction, which was an arrow, and then a variation of the arrow is I am in real danger from the enemy over here. The other form of ground signaling was using pop-up panels, which is what this is. And it's difficult to see, but it's a panel, and it sort of flips over, so you can form different signals. That's what those four soldiers would do, and those signals would be used for Morse. So much lengthier messages can be sent, but obviously it takes a while to do. And so an example of that in use is here. So this is Kabul. This is late 28 or early 29. So civil war. Aminullah Khan is overthrown, leaves. The British legation, which is what this is besieged, and there's an aerial evacuation of about 500 Europeans and Indians from Kabul. It takes a while because it's winter, and here you can see some signalling. So actually, that cross means all's well. You don't really need to spell it out in white stones by the side of it, but they have done. And then what you can see just on the bottom of the photo, there are some pop-on panels which are presumably giving a message. And what happened was the DH9 that was sent to drop pop-on panels to the legation was actually shot down. So the pilot and the signaller are actually working the pop-on panels. The pilot rescues his wireless transmitter from, sorry, the air gunner rescues his wireless transmitter from the DH9, and suddenly the legation have wireless communications as well. But an example of the pop-on panels in use. So the Air Force have wireless transmitters, which they provide to the Army. So they have these in vehicles, in tenders, but they also put them on mules. And when I first saw this, I thought, it's a Miranshah, it's a scout. But no, it's not. The soldier has boots, not sandals, like the scouts do, chapleys like the scouts do. So he's a soldier. And in any case, the scouts don't use mules. They have mounted infantry, but I can't imagine them using a mule burdened with a large wireless transmitter. And an airman would have to accompany it in order to work the transmitter. So I think it's pretty unlikely that they use these, and this is for the Army. There's also evidence of army signallers being trained in air cooperation at Miranshah because they get drunk and get into trouble. So Lawrence writes about that. And we know that the flight commander in charge of the detachment at Miranshah travels around because Lawrence tells us. So they went to Jandola, which is the headquarters of the South Waziristan Scouts. We know that Lawrence went there with the flight commander of the time, a guy called Smetham, and he gave the mess a book. And this is a copy of Revolt in the Desert that he gave them. He gave them a copy of his book. The note, I think, says this is the last copy he has, and it's to thank them for looking after him when he stayed in the officers' mess. He stays in the officers' mess because there's no other European accommodation. And then this is a picture of him. This is from the Jeremy Wilson collection. Jeremy Wilson is the biographer of Lawrence. He says it's at Tal. I'm not sure, it might be at Jandola, but it's another example of the flight going out and liaising with the scouts. But unfortunately, other than that, there's no evidence of them directly cooperating with each other. They're in the same area, at the same base, they're working to the same end, and they're working to the same people, the political agent, but there's no direct evidence of them working together. That may just be because it's not recorded. I mean, if it's routine reconnaissance or dropping supplies, which Trent says, then maybe it's just not recorded. November 28, I finish here. So November 28, there's lots of trouble in Waziristan. The red box at the bottom, or the middle of the map, the bottom red box, the Kiga and Neksan Keels of the Mahsuds have been sniping. They've taken a couple of Hindu hostages. They've got some troublemakers from across the Afghan border. The political agent wants to sort them out. He gives them a whole series of warnings over months, and it is literally months, and nothing much happens. So he calls in the Air Force. Extra aircraft are called in. So they're based at Miranshah. They're also based at Tonk, just across the administrative line. I think there's 12 aircraft involved, and over 2 days they bomb the villages. I've got some pictures of that. Meanwhile, the top red box there is Dada Keel. Again, it's a vizier area. There's the Torah Keel and Mada Keel there who've long been troublesome, and so the scouts are used against them. So they call it a barumpa, which means to pounce. So several companies will go out, surround the village, and try and capture the bad guys. So they're trying to achieve the same result, and both are successful. There are jirgas, things are resolved, fines are paid, service rifles handed over, miscreants handed over, and it's all resolved quite quickly. So an example of this peaceful period. And this is just to finish off. Really, this is what it looks like. So this is one of the villages. And bombs are dropped on houses and crops. The village has been warned. There are meant to be no villages here, and an aerial photo showing how good the photography is, showing what it looks like. That one's on its side. And everything is accounted for. So the number of bombs dropped, the cost of the bombs, the cost of the flying. So that raid cost the Indian government taxpayer £3,037. The estimate was that if it was a brigade expedition, blah blah blah, you can imagine the Air Force working this out, the political agent working it out. The estimate is that it would cost would have cost a lot more. Of course, I can't find the estimate now. But yeah, it would have cost a significant amount more. So my conclusions, this is like the dog that didn't bark, really, perhaps. So I was looking for evidence of cooperation between the Scouts and the RAF because they're based in the same place. And there's evidence that they're, as I've said, they're working for the same aim, they're working for the same people. But it's difficult to find direct evidence of them working together. And it may just be because either it's not recorded or because actually they didn't, because there weren't that many actions where the Scouts were involved during this period, where the Scouts called in, where it warranted the Scouts calling in air support, which would then have been recorded. So there's routine activity, there's reconnaissance, there's aerial reconnaissance, there might be some supply dropping. So there's routine liaison, routine cooperation. But when it comes to actions, the actions are either Scout actions like that Barumpa at Dadakil in November 28, or the action is prescription bombing by the Air Force, as in Giga, with the Giga kills and Nexan kill in November 28 as well. So I've spoken for long enough. Happy to take any questions, Dudley.
Just a couple from me, John. The uninitiated, of which I am one, would look at the interwar years, particularly when we're on expeditionary operations, etc. We look at the RAF doing punitive raids, and you've discussed that. And the examples that are always given are Iraq, aren't they? Is that because that's the best example of punitive raids, or can we draw some lessons from what happened on the frontier?
That's a good question. Iraq is where it starts, and more accurately, Kurdistan is where it starts probably. So the first example that's always given is Somaliland, but Iraq is where it starts. And the difference in Iraq is it's the Air Force that's in control. So it's actually John Salmond who becomes AOC Iraq, and he has military control. And his ground force are either RAF armored cars or levies that work for him. But it doesn't last very long. And I mean, as you say, the myth of Iraq. But in fact, you can get an air historical branch history of this if you Google air historical branch and small wars, and they produced a booklet which shows that actually all the prescription bombing in Iraq pretty much finished in the early 20s. So it's a bit of a myth that it continues, but there is quite a bit of it in the early 20s. In India, Pink's War is held up as the example. I've just given another one. What you get later in Waziristan from 36 onwards, it's air-land integration as we would understand it. And they produce quite a good handbook. So John Slessor, who writes Armies and Air Power, or Air Power and Armies, actually authors this handbook. So one of the myths is that there is air-land integration between the two world wars. It's just not implemented very well in France in 1940, but it is implemented much better in the Western Desert. So it is, I think, it is a bit of a myth. There is more of it than you would think.
Thank you. Another question for me, if I may.
Oh, wait.
It often happens that out of sight, out of mind, and therefore the RAF in India and on the frontier, are they really coping with obsolete aircraft, or are they trailblazing some of the modern craft?
That's another good question, because I should have said probably, the Bristol Fighter and the DH-9 are both First World War aircraft. So, and the Bristol Fighter's in service until 1932, so that's 14 years. And if you think that 14 years after it goes out of service is 1946, and we're flying jets. So they are kept in service for a long time. But that's because there are a lot of them there are a lot of spares. They can do the job. They're reasonably reliable once they have enough spares. So there's no great urgency to replace them. They can stooge around. They do attack. When they do an attack, they call it Vickers. They call it VBL, Vickers Bomb Lewis. So they go in, strafe with the Vickers front gun, drop the bombs, and then the rear gunner with his Lewis gun has a go with that as well. So they're quite popular. And the DH-9 is replaced by a plane called the Wapiti, which is basically a DH-9, bits of a DH-9 hung off a metal airframe. Later, they get modern types. So if you went to Miranshah in 1939, they've got Blenheims, for example. But they do, eventually catch up. They're using Hurricanes through the Second World War on the frontier. The Indian Air Force are there. It's where the Indian Air Force are employed, and they're using Hurricanes to support the units on the frontier.
Thank you. Yes, Mark's asked this question. He said, perhaps it's a silly question, but when the RAF launches a punitive bombing raid, are they regarding it as a method of dealing with an enemy who is a rational actor, who will stop his transgressions when they become too costly? Or is there a dimension of terror bombing involved, of frightening the natives into peaceful behaviours? In other words, is there any echo of contemporary discussions in the wider European context of the place of bombing as a war weapon?
Yeah, again, that's another really good question. So when air control starts in Iraq, going back to Dudley's question, or Mesopotamia, the idea is to be frightful. That's what they call it. So terror. And I mean, you've probably heard talk. There's another myth that on Churchill's orders, the RAF used gas, which is a myth. He wanted an investigation of using like mind control gas, but it was too difficult. And it was worked out that actually the best way to be frightful is to drop a bomb. So that's what they did. I think in India, well, you don't, what I've read, so the primary sources I've read, you don't get that attitude in India. The Pathans, as they were known, are regarded as rational actors. They're out, they're always out. There's always a reason why they're doing what they're doing. There's always a reason why they'll stop doing what they're doing. And hence, not many bombs are dropped. Not many people are killed. It doesn't happen very often. The political officers actually want to do more of it, but they're stopped by the government. And one of the reasons they're stopped by the government is the government thinks if you do it too often, you'll lose the effect. And if something really serious kicks off, so you have the red shirts in Peshawar in 1930, you have the Mamans in 1934, the army always take over. And so there isn't any prescription in bombing anyway, because the army take over and send a brigade. So it's a really good question, but it seems it is really closely connected with the political agents who are, they're Pashto speakers. They go from one agency to another agency. They spend quite a lot of time there. They're often regarded by the army as being too pro their own tribes. They refer to their tribes as their tribes. So I think it's and all of this is accounted for. All of this is explanations given afterwards, and it's always the Pashtun. They're British subjects, and they're rational actors. Hopefully that answers your question.
I think it answers Mark's question. Thank you. The interwar years are seen as certainly in Britain, if you like, is the rise of the RAF, isn't it? Of becoming almost the preeminent service, rivaling the army and the navy as such. Is there any evidence that they're trying to do that on expeditionary warfare as well? Is there any evidence that the RAF is trying to flex its muscles in India, which has always been the province of the army, isn't it?
So again, it's, another good, huge question. So air control, using the Air Force in the colonies is certainly a thing. So everyone's heard of the 10-year rule. And the 10-year rule, as well as saying there will be no war in Europe, we should plan on there being no war in Europe for 10 years. It also says the function of the army and the RAF is colonial control using mechanical contrivances, because that's how you save money, by not using men. And so that's what the Air Force does in the Middle East, where it has colonial control, and it's what it wants to do in India, but only does sort of occasionally. So Pink's War, that little raid I've just described, but the Indian Army, who's paying the Air Force's wages, won't let it take over. There are arguments for it taking over. They make the same arguments over and over again about how cheap it is, but they're never allowed to take over. But the army is very keen that they contribute, because the army can see the benefit of it. Yeah, I mean, the Air Force does become the most expensive service in the 30s in rearmament, because the biggest threat is the German Air Force.
Yeah,
and the army becomes a Cinderella service.
I suspected that was going to be the answer. It was interesting to have it confirmed. John, on behalf of the Society, can I thank you very much indeed for this evening's talk. It's always interesting to hear about the frontier, but always we see it from the land perspective. So to see it from the air has been quite informative. So once again, on behalf of the Society, thank you very much indeed. I will now close down the session and thank you all for attending, and see you all next month. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye,
Dudley.
everyone.